Hi, this is James Stemple, and you're listening to The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John and Pete.
We are in the studio here with you, and you've shown us about a couple dozen instruments, some of which you repurposed from other lives that objects had. And when we first walked in, the thing that was really interesting was your unique sonic signature that comes from the fact that your source material is a lot different from everybody else's.
Yeah, I try to go from an acoustic source.
Yeah.
I'm kind of an old school in that way. You know, I mean, I'm capable of doing, very processed, high-tech EDM sort of things, but I just in terms of my personal taste, I'm an analog guy.
Yeah.
There's something to be said for that, though. I mean, that sound wave does move through the room differently than if you just press a key and it comes out of a machine, Yeah. You hitting a stick way over there is going to sound different than hitting a stick over here. And
my attitude is that I embrace all the incredible things you can do with electronic technology, but for me, it's like a new section of the orchestra. I don't like using electronics to replace something that could be played by a live musician.
Right.
Sometimes you have no choice, because there isn't the budget.
Sometimes it's the right call.
Yeah. Well, like that thing that I played you, it was from Journeyman. It was a teaser where it was a processed orchestra. It was all electronic, but that really had a sound of its own. It wasn't.
Yeah, you wanted something that was violently sterile, if that's a thing.
Yeah.
And that's where that voice came in handy. But there's so many gadgets and neat little trinkets and stuff.
Oh, you can
here.
drown in them. I mean, that's sort of the problem, is that there's too much of everything.
Yeah.
I mean, I would rather focus and really get familiar with a smaller number of things than have a superficial relationship with the entire world of electronic sampling.
I hear you, and I believe you. But my eyes are seeing a can of oatmeal, a bunt ring, a meat grinder, and a metal ball full of ping pong balls. Metal ball.
Okay, let me name 5 things, because we could do this all day long. There's a stick filled with bicycle bells, a hammered dulcimer from God knows where, wind chimes that look like they came from a bamboo field someplace.
Thailand.
There's
A hippo's head.
so much beautiful stuff. There's a fucking bass kalimba.
Yeah. There's behind you a piece of electrical conduit, and then over here is a vacuum cleaner hose. I don't know if these things are multi-purposed. There's actually 2 pieces of vacuum cleaner hose. There's
Right.
the stiff piece and then the...
That's the alto and the tenor.
There we go. That's what everybody really needs to realize as you're listening to this show, that we're naming off these pieces of household appliances and whatnot, but these are all musical instruments.
Yeah.
Actually,
in the studio of James Stemple.
I have to differ, because there's 2 things that are not. They're here more for motivational means. You see that plow blade?
Yeah.
That came from my grandfather's farm. He was a farmer, way out in rural Appalachia, and he worked really hard. He was a really hard-working guy. So that inspires me to work. The meat grinder is more a statement about the music industry.
I was going to ask what you did with that. So,
Well, the plow blade is in a shadow box. So clearly it's meant to be revered and observed, as opposed to hit with a stick.
hit with a stick.
Or drawn across with a bow.
Yeah.
But everything else in here is fair game.
Yep.
And it's a lot of fun. You played a number of compositions for us that you did for a variety of projects, and you've done a lot of work. The first section of stuff that you played for us, I was really into how percussive everything was, because there were several pieces that didn't have a melody, that you just left the melody in the imagination of the viewer who was observing a thing, and then you'd lay the music way back so that it didn't clutter their observation. And I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the interest of not cluttering the imagination, you left the melody off. And there was a lot of percussion and a lot of even expression of the music, the movement of the composition with the percussion. And then the second block of stuff that you gave us was really melodic and very textural. And I feel like your ability to take us on so many different rides and really kind of provide the backdrop behind anything is what fascinates me. I started thinking one thing as we were, as you were playing little pieces for us, and left with a whole, we left off in Brazil in Cuba and then Brazil.
Started by terrifying us with that thing over there.
Yeah.
Hammered dulcimer.
The hammered dulcimer.
Bowed dulcimer.
Playing with a bow, yeah. Yeah, then we ended up in Brazil with sexy white pants on and
Right.
dancing.
Well, ultimately, the difference between doing film music and doing concert music is that, in a perfect world, the music is operating in reaction to the drama that's on the screen. So if I were not a film composer, I don't know if I would have explored all of these different genres, but that was what needed to be done. And for me, that's kind of fun. It's like taking a watch apart
Yeah.
and seeing how it works and then putting it back together again in your own way,
Putting a watch back together in your own way. I mean, if I put a watch back together in my own way, it wouldn't tell time.
You can't tell time.
The hand might wave back and forth. But let's rewind and start your musical journey from way, way back in your childhood as you first started exploring music. What were you into?
Well, as I mentioned to you, my dear sister, who was quite a bit older than I was, my half-sister, went to college and brought back a baritone ukulele. It's classic college thing, swallowing goldfish. And,
Yeah.
Well, I'm not that old, but... So that was my first instrument. She taught me how to play, coming around the mountain and 5'2", and all that.
Uh-huh.
But I also remember that was when I was about 6, I guess. And later on when I got into school, when I was like maybe 8, I recall my parents, they both worked. And every once in a while I would fake like I was sick. Mm-hmm. My mother would lead me home. And as soon as she left, I would pull her hat boxes down and take, the hangers that have the paper tube on the
Yes.
bottom. So,
Yeah.
I'd use those for drumsticks.
Yeah.
And I would just turn on the stereo. She was a big fan of Herb Alpert, So
Aren't we all?
I'd just sit there and play drums
Yeah.
on the hat boxes all day long, and I'd turn on the radio and just play with I wanted to play drums, but they wisely wouldn't allow it. So
sorry.
they bought me a guitar, which I liked, but I was not necessarily a great guitar player. So I moved over to the bass, and then it was all over. I just took off with that.
I see. You'd found your voice.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting because where I really started to play music was when I was about 12, and the Beatles were big, and it was an incredible time in music. I can remember like waiting for the next Led Zeppelin album to come out. Standing outside the store.
Right. We had anticipation for music, unlike the generation that consumes music now.
Right.
And I'm not saying, those young, whatever. They have their own experience, but our experience really had a lot to do with anticipation for the music. And then the music landing on you was an event because you would consume that music in a block, whether it was the new Led Zeppelin record would come out, and then you wouldn't let go of that thing for,
you'd wear it out.
Yeah.
Have to go buy another one.
Right.
I think that at that period of time, part of the beauty of why music evolved the way it did was because we didn't have like the access to the web that we have now. You can find anything. I had to really go looking for stuff, and sometimes I felt kind of weird, because I was looking in odd bins at the record store, that nobody else was listening to. And I really got, I was fortunate. I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., and there was a big attraction to soul music. So the first bands that I played in when I was 12 was a bunch of little suburban Richie Cunninghams playing in their basement, James Brown and Wilson Pickett,
right.
Sex Machine.
Yeah.
That's pretty funny thought if you think about it, And then I just kind of graduated into progressively higher forms of music, so
no less soulful, just progressively higher forms.
yeah, and then in the next band I played, I worked with a guitar player named Steve Bishop. We had a band called Steve Bishop and the Chessmen.
Uh-huh.
And he was the first virtuoso that I ever met. He was an incredible guitar player.
Wow.
And
Where's Steve Bishop today?
unfortunately, he's passed away. He died of cancer a while ago, which was very sad. But the drummer from that band, Matt Apps, plays in a band called Government Mule. He played with the Allman Brothers. He really went down that road big time. But it was a really, really fantastic experience, and I was able to, all that music that you're talking about from that period, I was actually able to bring that into my soul and actually perform it. It was
Sure.
a great time. So
It makes plenty of sense, though. Based on us looking around your
Yeah.
stuff and your collection of instruments, it really makes sense that you were a crate digger back then and that you really seeked out all those great records.
And then
I
going
was-
through that array of music that you've created, you don't just walk in and start dealing in Cuban music, music that's for video games, music that's Appalachian in nature, like you across the board. You don't get that from staying in the, the simple rack.
pocket, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You got to move around.
Well, part of that is due to the fact that I've been very fortunate to be presented with a lot of different musical petri dishes, and I've kind of gravitated. I never did a series, like a hit series. A friend of mine, Steve Bramson, wrote the show Jag for 10 years. you know,
Right.
and lucky, he doesn't have to work again.
Right, yeah.
But I never had that experience. I wrote some episodes of Jag for him, but I, was constantly having to migrate and move around wherever the heat was. So, like, for example, I played you some animation music. I did
Right.
that was really hot back in the 90s, mid-90s. And so I did that for 3 years exclusively.
3 years of that, I'm
Oh,
just
man.
happy it didn't drive you insane.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I kind of came to the point. I bought a convertible, and I was driving down this. It was a burnout. I mean, it was like I was up all night, one night a week, every week. It's just an impossible amount of labor by the minute. There was sometimes, depending on the complexity,
Yeah.
I might write just 30 seconds of music a day, working for 12 hours. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
30 seconds of manic.
Yeah, and it
Just-
changes like every 10 frames.
Right.
It's opera, and then it's, this and that.
Yeah.
But it was a great experience, and it really built up my dramatic chops. Like, I couldn't have written, I played you that
The
Chase.
cartoon piece, yeah.
No, the Chase.
Oh, the Chase, right.
Yeah, with the,
For the Donald
That was done in
Sutherland
London, yeah. I never could have done that had I not written cartoons.
Right.
Because you learn doing animation, learn you need to be able to move a lot of air really quickly. You
Yeah.
know? You have to be able to turn on a dime, and change styles and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, and then that kind of dried up, and I wound up doing documentaries, whole different trip. This film right here, Shakespeare Behind Bars, was all Appalachian music, and as I mentioned to you, it was kind of a mixture between concert music and Appalachian. Lots of slide guitars, and all that sort of thing. And that project was the tip of the sword that brought all these instruments in. One of the things that really stretched me stylistically was doing commercials, music for advertising, because they are all over the map.
Really?
Yeah, and they'll ask for a big band, and they wind up with a hip hop piece. It's wild.
Wow. How I want to go back to when you were playing with Steve and the Chessmen, because I want to really explore how that informs the variety that you're able to deliver now and the virtuosity with which you deliver it. So you were playing soul music in the basement. It was 5 white kids in suburban Washington, D.C., and you were playing soulful stuff, James Brown, etc. Where did you go from there? You progressed as a bass player?
Yeah, well, originally, I started off as a guitar player, and I wasn't particularly outstanding at it. But when I took up the bass, I was just, it spoke to me, So I played with the Bishop Band, and that was, I did that for 3 years while I was in high school, and that was, we did a little bit of that kind of funk, but it was really more rock and roll, like the Allman Brothers, Deep Purple, Jeff Beck, Led Zeppelin, and Steve was incredibly gifted.
It was funky rock, though.
Yeah, oh yeah. No, great stuff. But every popular music form leans towards one instrument. Like in country western music, if you want to play third bass, you want to be on the hot seat, you're the pedal steel player.
Right.
Or the guitar player. I wouldn't want to be a drummer in a country western band,
Yeah.
No offense to country western music, but
There's a lot of great country western drummers.
No,
but
there are.
they're there to provide a backbeat.
exactly.
Stay out of the
it's
way.
not like John Bonham,
Right.
So after I got out of school and really wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and so I took a year off before I went to college, and I moved over to a 10-piece funk band
Okay.
doing Tower of Power covers and Earth, Wind, and Fire. And man, so the bass is the hot seat.
Right.
with that music.
Oh yeah,
and I
following Rocco around playing that stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean, I love that guy. Was a really big influence on me. Rocco Prestia and
Verdine.
Yeah, but you know, I toured with that band, and I couldn't see myself when I was 50 years old still thumping on that bass, playing in Detroit and staying in a motel. We stayed in a motel one night in Detroit, and somebody got murdered, you know, on the floor below us. You know, yeah, kind of hardcore.
Did you see yourself doing anything in particular, though? I mean, you couldn't see yourself playing bass.
Well, all I knew is I loved music, but it was too much of a risk, and security was something that was really important to me. So I started looking around for something that was creative yet secure, and I came up with architecture.
Okay.
So I worked my way, it was not easy, into the architecture program at the University of Arizona, and I was well on my way. You know, fortune really smiled on me. I got back to school late one year, and I couldn't find a place to stay, and I met this realtor who had a place for lease, and he said, it's been taken. Come down and talk to me about buying a place. I said, you got to be kidding me. I ride a bicycle, you know.
I ride a bicycle. I'm a student.
He was the best salesman I ever saw in my life. You know, 3 days later, I own my own home.
He made it happen.
Wow.
I found a house for $1,000 down.
Uh-huh.
Total price was less than the down payment on my house here in L.A., like $36,000. I went to my dad. I said, you know, look, you're going to be giving me $120 a month to live on. Give me $1,000 now. I'll give it back to you when I leave. So he co-signed for my loan, rented out all the rooms, lived there for free. I mean, you know, my life was like paved to be an architect. And I was minoring in music, and I was playing a lot of classical guitar because it's not really fun to play bass by yourself, you know. And the music director knew that I was a bass player, and he caught me in the hallway one day, and he said, hey, have you heard Jocko's album?
Oh, boy.
And I said, Jocko who?
Shit.
He said, run out and buy his
right now. Stop what you're doing.
He was absolutely right. I listened. I've never been so blown away by, you know, Jaco Pastorius' debut album.
Right.
I mean, I was a very good bass player, but this guy was doing stuff.
This is the story.
I was a very good bass player, and then I heard the Jocko album.
Oh man! I mean, you know, I was like, you know, this deep into what that guy was. You know, I mean, he just took everything that I even possibly dreamed of and blew it up. You know, and you know, it was incredible. And so, you know, biggest decision I ever made in my life. I sold the house, applied to the University of Miami, where Jocko had, you know, he was still his fumes in the building there. He used to teach there, you know.
Yeah.
And dropped it all and went back into music. You know,
what'd your dad think of that? He got his $1,000 back. You sold the house.
Yeah. Well, my parents, you know, they said, you know, you've done really well. You know, we believe in you, but we only have enough money. It's a private school. You know, I'm living for free.
Right.
My tuition is $200 a month.
Right.
And now I want to go to a private school. It's $8,000 a semester. I mean, God knows what it is now.
Yeah,
he said, we've got enough money to send you down for one semester.
Wow.
So I said, okay, I'll go down there and see if I can get a scholarship. If I can, I probably shouldn't be there. So I went down and I got a quarter scholarship.
Man, that's balls. Hold on. That's balls.
Yeah, it was.
If I don't get a scholarship, I probably shouldn't be there. And now I'm going to Miami.
Yeah, and I graduated on a full scholarship.
Leaving a sure thing.
Yeah. Because,
Well-
I mean, I don't think Ricky Williams said, you know, if I don't get down there on a scholarship, I probably don't belong there.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you're talking about just enormous brass.
Well,
brass.
you know, when you're 21 years old, you know, you're willing to take chances like
Sure.
that. I mean, that's what your 20s are all about.
Maybe
is
you
that
didn't
kind
know any better. But it worked out. You went to University of Miami,
And
caught some of Jocko's old fumes that were down there.
I'll tell you one thing real quickly. I drove down to Miami, and you have to understand this house that I had in Tucson was gorgeous. I used to ride my bike down this one street, 3rd Street. It was the bike path.
Mm-hmm.
And the last 3 blocks before you got to the university were beautiful homes like you'd find in Westwood, right over by UCLA.
Yeah.
And I would look at those houses. I mean, I was dirt poor, and I would say, man, one of these
One
days, my house was on the 4th block. It was a beautiful place.
You were a block away from one day.
Yeah. And so I pack up my car, and I drive. At that point, I had a car. I drove down to Miami, and I pull in. It's hot. It's humid. I check into this Holiday Inn. Whoever was in the room before me was a heavy smoker and wore Aqua Velva.
All right.
Sexy.
And the whole room is like maroon burgundy velvet.
Of course.
I wake up
It just soaks all that up.
I wake up the next morning, I drive across the street to the university, and it looks like Gitmo.
Mm-hmm.
I pull my car up to the curb, and it was about to rain, super humid. I sit down on the curb, and I almost cried. I just put my head in my hands. I thought, what
Good
have
God,
I done?
Yeah.
I have ruined my life. And
At
fortunately,
21.
it all turned around, you know. So, so at Miami, I got an exposure to jazz in a really big way, which was the next notch up from funk. I got an exposure to writing, not orchestral music, but I learned a lot about arranging for big band, for small groups. And then when I got out of school, I was fortunate. I played with a lot of really great musicians, and I subbed for a lot of really great bass players down there. And when I graduated, I was working with a group, some of the faculty members from the school, and a couple of other guys, you know, first-rate players. But I was making $40 a night, $160 a week, and I couldn't live on it.
Yeah.
So I started taking some jobs on the cruise ships, and that was pretty interesting. You know, I got to play. It was sort of like going back to Vegas like 40 years ago. So it was performers like Vic Damone
Yeah.
and Rita Moreno.
All right.
A lot of comics, you know, Charlie Callis,
Yeah.
Martin Mull, you know, I mean, all these, you know, played behind Don Rickles once, you know.
Wow.
But it was a really great experience. And some of the arrangers, like, I mean, I remember working with Della Reese. Wow, she was such a powerhouse. And the arrangements that these people had, like Diane Carroll had a like fantastic arranger, you know. So that was a really good, you know, really great experience. And I had like a, you know, 6-hour work week. You know, I played 2 shows on 2 nights with these people, and then I played like this Vegas review, and that was it. You know, and the rest of the time I could just sit around listening to music, and you know, they had pianos everywhere, so that was kind of good. And I really started to gravitate towards composition. I started listening to a lot of classical music, and all of a sudden one day I got off the ship, and my ex-girlfriend at the time was standing there waiting for me with a piece of paper, and she said, "Call this guy. They're looking for a bass player." And it was a contractor for a chorus line, which was doing a national tour.
Wow.
And I got hired right on the spot and toured with that group for 50 weeks. And that allowed me to make the money I
Wow.
needed to do to come to L.A.
Okay.
I kept waiting for you to say, and then I found Latin music because you've got such.
Well, I found that down in Miami.
Okay, you did find that down
yeah.
there. Okay. All right.
But here's the interesting thing. Down in Miami, it's like a little chunk of Cuba that broke off.
Sure, yeah.
It's the real deal. You
But
know?
there's also a chunk of Colombia, and there's a chunk of
Oh, yeah,
Panama,
yeah,
there's
yeah,
a chunk
yeah.
of all those.
Yeah, absolutely.
all that, yeah.
But here's the deal, is that like all the horn players in the school were working part-time in all these Latin bands,
Okay.
but never in the rhythm section.
Huh.
They would never hire Anglos they let you marry their daughters,
Right.
but they're not going to let you lay down the groove, you know?
Right.
So I was exposed to a lot of that music, but I hadn't really played the real thing until I came out to L.A. And there it was flipped. And so my first 6 months here, I just did, I mean, I'm not talking like the Congo Room. I'm talking like down in Gardena, Downey,
Right.
the real Mambo Kings, blue collar, real deal.
No shit.
You know, it was great. Except all the charts
But
were in
you
Spanish, and I
lived
didn't.
in Miami, and you didn't really get the opportunity to get down and dirty and really play
I
Latin
could
music
hear it. I could hear
until
it, but
you
I couldn't
moved to
play.
L.A.
Yeah, right.
Wow. That's kind of mind-blowing.
You wouldn't think that Downey would be the place that you would go to
Yeah.
pick up your Latin
To understand
chops
what
in
it is
real
to be
time.
Cuban.
Yeah.
I mean, I could write, you know, if the Mambo Kings hadn't been written, I could write a book about it. I mean, you know, I was always, you know, like the only Anglo in the room. The charts were all in Spanish. So, you know, you'd see a repeat sign. It would say tres veces. I didn't know what that meant. I mean,
Right.
3 times. I play it twice and go on. I'm kind of sick of getting lost.
Yeah, wow.
So what really impressed me about that music, unlike other cultures, particularly America and American pop music, you can have 2 kids in America that are like 3 years apart, and they hate each other's music, you know?
Yeah.
You go to a salsa club, you see 4 generations there.
Right.
And they all
And
love
they all
the
love
music.
everything, yeah.
Yeah, and the music, the thing that's unique about Cuban music and salsa is it almost seems a little bit, and this is a very abstract analogy, but it kind of reminds me of the web. It's like a river that's constantly flowing, like a conveyor belt. And it's like the web. It's always out there. And when you go to play that music,
You just tap
plugging,
into
you're
it.
plugging into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's something like that's always been going on and always will go on. you know?
Right. And it is a rhythm and a tempo of nature.
Oh, yeah.
the compositions that you played us. Now you played something that was sort of gaucho, Argentinian,
That's right.
and you played us some Brazilian stuff, and you played us some Cuban stuff, and your arrangements were interesting and took you for a ride. But the compositions themselves were just magnificent.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
I mean, it blows my mind that you got your authenticity in Los Angeles because, man, I mean, and I love bossa novas, man. I love them.
Well, actually, that's not completely true. It's true with Cuban music,
Okay.
but the other Latin American music, was all kind of, the funny thing is like, I've done all these styles. I've done Arabian music, I've done Latin music, you name it, 30s, big band, jazz. Usually the first time I get asked to do something it comes out the best because I'm really inspired and it's all new to me,
Wow.
But I have to,
You go immerse yourself first.
Yeah, I'm really big on research. See all these books here? I've actually read those books. And, when I went down, so I wind up with this project, Walton El Grupo, that was shot all over South America. The director was a musician. And
Who was the director?
Ted Thomas.
Okay.
And his wife, Kuniko, produced it. Ted's father was Frank Thomas. I actually met him when they made a movie called Frank and Ollie. I wrote a couple of cues about Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson that were two of the famous, I think it was eight old men they referred to with Disney. Then they were the fathers of this sort of, they called Frank the Laurence Olivier of animation. He would do all the heartfelt, like Bambi, the parts that would break your heart. The guy was brilliant, and so I'll try to make this concise. World War II is about to break out. The Germans are getting footholds all down in South America. State Department's really nervous about it. We're not in the war yet. Mm-hmm. So they create this program called the Good Neighbor Program, and they get Walt Disney, Orson Welles, and Leopold Stokowski, and they send them all down there to buddy up with the South Americans.
Okay.
They want them to think that we're great. And they send them down, they told Walt Disney, go down there, take your best people.
And just make friends.
Cross-pollinate with their artists, come back and make a movie about it. If it doesn't sell, we'll subsidize it. Yeah, right. So that was the deal, and
so he took Frank Thomas down there?
He took Frank and about 12 other people. They were all different artists, animators, musician, composer. And Ted made a movie about that trip, and he sort of followed in his footsteps. So now Ted is actually an excellent musician. He plays cornet and is really big into like late 30s jazz.
Oh, wow.
And he really knows music, and he knew exactly what he wanted. And what wound up happening is, while Walt Disney was down in South America, there was a strike. And when he came back, he basically went down there to get away from it because it broke his heart. And when he got back, none of the people were there that went down to South America with him. So he had to make a movie with people that hadn't been there.
Wow.
And it actually wound up having, to a certain degree, kind of the opposite intent because they kind of focused on stereotypes, and it just pissed everybody off down there.
John and Pete.
Hey, everybody, if you like the Break It Down show,
I can dig it.
And of course you do.
of course you do, hit that subscribe button.
John and Pete.
It helps us out.
Hey, if you're going to like the show on Facebook or on Twitter, it helps us out if you share the show so people can learn about it. So liking it is great. Sharing is even better.
Let's do some spy stuff.
Yeah, just
Let's
sneak
get
in
all
there.
our friends' phones and have them subscribe to the Break It Down show. Do it. Subscribe. Listen to the show. If you love the show, tell 5 of your friends. Or if you hate the show, tell 5 of your friends.
So Ted's instruction to me was, we're not going to make that mistake again. I want this music to be really authentic. Yeah. So I spent $5,000 of my own money and frequent flyer miles, and I flew down there with a fellow named Colin Walker that I met, who was in a Brazilian group here in town. Little did I know his mother was Shirley Walker, who gave me one of my first scoring jobs. A great composer. He lived in Buenos Aires, and he also lived in Rio. Fluent in both languages, excellent musician, knew all these players. And so we went down there, and man, I got to tell you, what a trip that was. 10 days. If I wasn't sleeping, I was at a recording studio. I was hearing concerts. I was going over to people's houses. It was fantastic.
You were truly soaking it in.
Oh, wait, picture this. It's kind of like, let's say you were from Rio and you flew into town and I picked you up at the airport. And as we're driving to your hotel or whatever, I would say, we're going to make a quick stop at Stevie Wonder's house.
Yeah.
That's what it was like.
Right.
Yeah.
And you got all the best access and everything.
Yeah, it was incredible. I came back with like $1,000 worth of CDs, a bunch of musical instruments, but I never could have done that score had I not done that research.
Right. Yeah, you had to feel that. It had to come out of you.
Right. So
and you went to Rio with a guy named Colin Walker.
Yeah.
And
'cause
he
was
knew
your expert.
everybody.
So is that not an uncommon approach though for a composer? I mean, is that not your guys' life?
Well, I think everybody, does their homework to a certain degree. I think that's kind of like a little bit pinned to the right as far as commitment, but that's, I hate to phrase it this way because it sounds less than modest, but I don't fool around,
Yeah. But I don't gather that you do. I'm looking around here and there's no fooling around going
I mean,
on.
if you're going to do it, do it.
Right.
Do it right,
So you get an assignment, you have a comfort level with the music that you're about to consume. I'm assuming that because when you showed us or when you played for us the music that you had, you gave us some cues as to what we should feel and see as we were doing it. You put Sophia Loren up, in our mind and everything. And do you think in those terms before you go to put hands on keys or grab a stick?
No,
or?
I'm looking at the picture. I'm looking at what I don't have my writing board up right now. I have this custom board that I put on my piano, and there's all kinds of little Post-its on it, and one of them says, and that's actually a line from Frank Thomas. He said, what's the character feeling?
Yeah.
And why do they feel that way?
Okay.
So it's kind of a very diplomatic art form. You have to know when to step up and move things along because they're not moving. And when things are really happening, you have to know how to back off and let the thing breathe,
Yeah, this is something I really wanted to try to dig into. Is it seems to me that there are certain sounds that are sort of required, for I'm going to show someone going down the stairs and there's tension. And then so you have a certain lane, I would imagine, that you've got to kind of stay within. That lane might be big. And then the other part of that thing is timing. Like, do certain audiences require more time either in advance of the thing to hear, like so they can hear it, they're ready for it, and they see it? And then is it possible also that you have to slow down the thing so they see it, then they hear it, and then they can get it? I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. When I was in architecture school, my first semester, we're all like 20 years old.
Right.
And we all want to make our mark. Bunch of testosterone laden,
Right.
a couple of women in there as well. But everybody, basically, we hadn't really had the training, that form follows function, that the buildings in modern architecture grow from the inside out, not the outside in, like the old Beaux-Arts.
We need columns. It's like it's a safe way.
Yeah. So, but everybody there, what's in their back of their mind, I promise you, is I want to do a really slick building.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. So there's this
going
guy.
to get me laid by chicks who drive by it.
Right.
Yeah. I want racing stripes on my building.
But this McDonald's has gargoyles.
Right. So the guy next to me, we're doing our first design project of a full building, and you have to build a model.
Right.
It takes like 70 hours. Like it's to
So
scale.
hard. Yeah.
You have to cut little pieces of balsa wood, and you use X-ray film for the windows, and you have to take cardboard and shave it so it's just the right height, so the right number of stairs.
Right.
That you would. It's brutal. So
It is brutal.
So this guy is, they call it architorture. You go by the architecture building at 4 a.m, the lights are always on, So this guy next to me is doing this building, and he's starting to attract attention because it's a really cool looking building. Only one problem. He's designing it from the outside in, which doesn't sit so hot with his design crit.
Right.
This guy named McNeil, tough Scottish guy, humorless. McNeil keeps, I'm right next to him, so I can hear all the conversations. McNeil keeps telling him to change the building. This is not the way you do it. You got it ass backwards, Well, the guy thought that his building was so precious when he would try to change, he would change a door swing. He would move a window over by
Yeah.
like 3 inches, but it was his little jewel. And finally, McNeil took his model,
Oh boy.
dropped it on the floor, and stepped on it. He started crying.
I bet.
I mean, I couldn't believe it. But it taught me a very valuable lesson: is that every single idea you have is expendable. And once you embrace that, to answer your question now,
Yes.
any cue can be done 20 different ways.
Right.
And they're all valid. It just depends on what you want to say.
But you have to know the route so that you can go off in your own direction. You can't just go willy-nilly and go wherever you want to go.
Well, you want the score to be cohesive,
Right.
So, I don't tend to write from left to right. I jump around, and try to, I think one of the main requirements of being a film composer is having a high degree of tolerance for chaos and having things that are unresolved up in the air and being okay with that. Just knowing, you only get that from doing it for a while.
Because the music has to come to you when it comes to you. I mean, like you're in the
Yeah,
shower
yeah. I mean,
and you're
if I get stuck on something, I'll go to another place in the
Right.
film,
Okay.
and that's not a bad thing because that allows me to develop a certain, coherence or cohesiveness, a through line to the score that ties everything together. And when you're writing that way, like that film Bukowski, Born Into This, that's a very eclectic score. It has basically a piano quintet or a string quintet, a string quartet with piano, and it's very much chamber music. But there's also like a 60s boogaloo piece in it. There's like a 50s Charles Mingus sax quartet,
Right.
that's just like down sleazy 50s, hardcore gutter stuff. But it all works, it all fits together. And to be honest with you, I can't really explain how you do that. You just do.
Yeah.
That's not a very articulate answer, but by jumping around in the score, you kind of get an idea how things are going to fit together. And for example, in the case of that sax piece, it's a nice breath of fresh air. Because, let's talk about music licensing,
Yeah.
If somebody's going to throw a song in, that doesn't disrupt your train of thought with the film,
Sure.
That's a standalone.
Yeah, and there's no reason why underscoring can't be the same way. But you do have to have a unifying principle, a tone. That's actually the most difficult thing. I struggle sometimes with people that insist on demos. If we're afraid to get the job. The most difficult thing is coming up with the tone for the film.
In order to get that, you have to spend the time and you have to be with the film.
Yeah. I mean, you're doing like because the rest of it, once you get that, then it all just spins out. Like a piece of fabric. But when someone asks you to demo something, they're asking you to do like all the heavy lifting. 60% of the work.
So they can hear it and decide.
Yeah, and you don't always get that the first time. I mean, the ideal way to write is to have somebody who likes your style, likes, your approach, your point of view. One thing I struggle with is I've done so many different kinds of music, people can't pigeonhole me into for example, that Arabian score. I'd never written any Arabian music before I did that. So how would somebody know that I could do that? Well, they just know that I've done it.
Right.
I've done A, B, and C, and so I can probably do D.
Well, it seems like you've gotten to a place in your career that a lot of actors that we admire more visibly get to, which is where, say, Samuel Jackson is, where you either want Samuel Jackson,
Yeah.
or it's not the type of film where you want Samuel Jackson. He's not going to come and audition and win you over. You either know that you want him or not, or you can say, this might be a stretch for him, but if he wants to do it, I want to give him the reins.
Yeah, look at a guy like Edward Norton.
Yeah.
Or what's that other guy? Gary.
Oldman.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or Sinise. Which one?
Yeah.
Either
one.
Gary.
Either one.
Gary. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when somebody gets James Stemple, they say, I don't know what this is going to sound like yet, but I'm going to trust the process.
The people that get the best scores say that.
Yeah.
But that takes a lot of trust, and it takes a lot of faith in the other person. And to be honest with you, in all fairness, a lot of people that I work with, I mean, they've been working on this movie for 6 years.
Sure.
It's their child.
It is precious.
Yeah. And
They need to know that you're not going to be the guy who throws it on the ground and stomps
yeah,
on
and
it.
if it doesn't work, That's it. So they've got a lot riding on it, you know. So I kind of understand.
How often does somebody ask you for a demo nowadays?
It happens all the time.
Wow.
Yeah. Or they'll ask to hear something like what they want,
Right.
you know, from your library. But I mean, you know,
And you can't get into somebody's head and understand what
No.
they want. Besides that, they might want the wrong fucking thing.
That's exactly right.
Because sometimes
Exactly.
you get the guy. I mean, guarantee you don't think, hey, if we get Rocco Prestia, let's tell him what we have in mind. You don't tell him what you have in mind. You
No,
stay
you
out
do
of his
not.
fucking
No,
way.
no, actually, that's not completely true for me. I mean, I don't mind. A lot of guys really don't like temp tracks. I really don't mind them because if nothing else, it shows you what not to do.
Okay.
That's actually kind of the core of it. Rather than just rip off whatever music that they have there and try to mimic it, you look at it and you see, okay, that works. Why does it work?
Right.
It's the tempo. The tempo works. That's a
Okay.
perfect tempo. And so I might cop the tempo.
Right.
Because they've cut the picture to that. And so that makes that takes away a lot of hard work, you know, trying to hit everything, you know, that needs to be hit if you're doing that. But getting back to the other thing, talking about like Samuel Jackson. Well, look at a guy like Danny Elfman or
Yes.
Tommy Newman,
Right.
you know, and you do a film that just goes through the roof. American Beauty.
Right.
Now, I don't really know Tommy Newman, but I would imagine that for the longest time, he got calls to write American Beauty all over again.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is about your compositional choices too. Do different actors, does Samuel Jackson have like 10 instruments that really say what he does on screen? Because he does what he does on screen. It's usually within the vein. Or is it a type of character and you're like, oh, this is the bad guy, I've got to grab the kalimba?
Oh, kalimba's not a bad guy instrument.
Well, whatever. I was just trying to think of something. Yeah.
No, I mean, you know, I mean, if you're really firing on all 12 cylinders, and that gets back to architecture school. Like in between our big design projects, we would have these sketch projects. So
Right.
you know, for like a week, you'd have to design a chair, you know, or you'd have to, you know, just a small
Sure.
creative thing. One thing we had to do was design a playground, and they gave you like 8 shapes, you know, like a tube.
Sure.
A triangle, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
A half tube.
right.
And most of the people in my class were trying to find creative ways to use all of those. I chose one of them and combined them, and it came out great. So if you're really firing on all 12 cylinders, there was a movie that Dave Grusin scored a little while ago. It was a John Grisham story. I can't remember the name of it. He did the whole thing with a piano.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, so those kind of restrictions can actually bring out your creative lion by trimming things down and having a box to work with. That's what I like about film music. For example, that cue that I played you, that chase, I never would have written that had I not had a picture to work to. It's like an obstacle course.
Okay.
And you know that you have to be there at a certain point. So, whoops, here's a 3/8 bar.
We got to get there.
Yeah.
Can you bite yourself in the butt by saying, I love this dobro that I just bought. I need to use it in the next project, and it doesn't need that? Or have you passed that point?
I got a lot of stuff around here that hasn't been used yet. You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really something I think about. But what I do think about is the thing that we were talking about earlier. I was fortunate to come up as a ghostwriter. So, you know, my first gig was working on primetime television. You know,
Okay.
I had orchestra every week.
Wow.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, where do you get that kind
That's
of
a great set of tools.
It's fantastic. And the composers I was working for were all first rate. I learned so much from them, and I had to sound like them.
Yeah.
That's one place where I learned to do all these styles. They would hand me their scores, and I would look at them, and I'd pick them apart, the watch.
Yeah.
You know, I'd look at the movement, you know.
Right.
Oh, okay, that's how he does this. All right. So, and then I would write a piece of my own. But the object is his piece is here, my piece comes next, and you don't notice a
And you
difference.
don't understand. Yes, right. It's seamless.
And you do that without ripping him off, but you understand what the colors are. So, you know, that's a very valuable experience,
yeah.
you know.
In centuries past, that's how artists in general learned how to do it. You go to the Louvre and start painting what's already been painted, and like, oh, this is how Leonardo does it. This
Right.
is how
Or
my-
take an apprenticeship with somebody who
Yeah.
would say, I use these strokes. You should learn these strokes. And
Right.
eventually you'll break away and figure out your own strokes. But here's where you
exactly. You know, and it's almost like an incubation period. You know?
Right.
And so I was fortunate. Right out of school, I shared a composition teacher with this fellow named Bruce Broughton, who's just a fantastic orchestral composer, writes a lot of concert music. He's really one of the true geniuses. That's not a word I really use lightly, but it took a long time to forge a relationship with him, but eventually I started ghostwriting for him. And I remember at one point, he handed me a pile of his scores as an example of what he was doing. It was for that same film. And my heart started pounding. I started looking through the stuff. I said, this is a ticket to the A-list. This is how it's done.
Wow.
I mean, that was a really moving experience. But I didn't come away with that writing like Bruce Broughton.
Mm-hmm.
I took all of his techniques, which ironically, as I mentioned to you, really wound up boiling down to not writing big orchestra music, but realizing the value of smaller ensembles and the transparency and the intimacy that comes with that.
Yeah.
And then using that in my own way. So, like, I don't know if I could have written the score to Walton El Grupo had I not had that orchestral experience with Bruce, which had nothing to do with that score.
Yeah. Right. But you did show us with that piece that you played for us and a few other pieces that you played for us from other things where you would have a great ensemble thing going where there was a lot of movement and it was really sonically powerful, and then you'd drop things out and show the beauty and the subtlety of a single instrument or a single voice. Or
silence.
Mm-hmm.
Oh boy, yeah, we love.
I mean,
this.
when you get things going, and everybody's like following, and all of a sudden you take the music out, whoosh, everybody's focus goes right up on the screen.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, that's cool.
That is a running theme among virtuous people that we've had on our show is that I had to learn all these chops and I had to learn all this technique and I had to learn all these different approaches. And eventually what I became appreciative of was how to use space.
Yeah. When you're a young composer starting out, let's say you're working on a project and there's going to be 5 different ensembles, and somebody gives you a cue to do and they say, which orchestra do you want to use? If you're a young guy, I want the 90 pieces.
Of course.
Yes.
Well, one of the things
Give me them all.
One of the things I learned from Bruce, and it was that cue that I played for you.
Yeah.
And he told me this after the fact. He said, when you have an orchestra of that size, you're limited to writing in primary colors. Because there's so much sound going on. It's such a wall of sound.
You got to do it in broad strokes.
Yeah, it's like driving a tractor trailer in the Indy 500. I mean, you can pull a big weight, which those other cars can't do. But here's another analogy. Let's say the Air Force needs to do an airstrike. They don't send in 50 fighter jets. They send in 2.
Right.
Right? Because these guys need to be really fluid and nimble and be able to move around. So it's kind of the same thing with music. Now, there's a time and a place. You have 90 pieces.
Sometimes you do bring the freight truck.
Yeah, well, that's what I did in that cue, to be honest with you. I mean, if I had it to do over again, I would use like a 65-piece or a 50-piece orchestra because there's more in there that you can't even hear. It's buried by the massive sound. I had like 5 layers going.
Yeah.
I mean, it still works and it generates a lot of energy, but it would be even more effective with a smaller ensemble.
Like we were talking, you were playing earlier for us the Brazilian lady when she sang in.
Luciana. Martelena. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is as simple as you can get, but she's so perfect at it. You don't need the other things there.
Well, and the challenge in doing that arrangement was it goes on for almost 7 minutes, and I only had 7 players.
Right.
So how are you going to keep that interesting? So I just held everybody back. I didn't bring players in until the absolute last minute where what I was dealing with was starting to get old.
Right.
And then I'd bring in another instrument.
Yep. That's a technique that you will, for our listeners, begin to pick up on records that you love, is how much is held back. Because everybody loves the vamp. We're coming in back from the solo. We're going to hit you hard, real hard, with that chorus and the horn part. And we're really going to nail you to the wall with it. And then there's the big finish. And why don't you just do the whole song like that? Well, you don't do that. That's why that's valuable, is because you didn't do the whole song like that. And often you'll have that song that starts with the verse. And instead of going to the chorus, it goes back to the second verse. Except it goes to the second verse, but now the guitar player comes in.
Right.
And he's just doing that little part, and you build it and build it and build it, and sometimes the beauty comes when you take it all back. And like you played us the piece with the vocal at the end where everything fell out and it was just the vocal, and that's for the first time in the song where you could hear the vibrato and the retard, and then when she quieted down to the end of the song and how she held
That's a very
it.
perceptive observation. I have two more abstract analogies. If you work in an office with fluorescent lighting that buzzes nonstop, after about a couple of minutes, your ears are just going to tune it out.
You don't hear it anymore, yeah.
Right. It's the same thing with music. If the music is always, that's one of the signatures of a lot of scores that I do. There's not really that much music.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's a mark of a bad movie a lot of times, if it's wall-to-wall music. But if
It's hiding behind the music.
If the music is like wallpaper and it's constantly going, your ears dull up to it, and that's, it just kind of tunes it out. When I was in school in Arizona, I played a lot of tennis, and I made friends with this woman that was the number one on the women's tennis team. And at the University of Arizona, that's a pretty good tennis player.
Mm-hmm.
So I would go out and play tennis with her, and she had such control over the ball. I felt like she was a cat, and I was just like a little ball.
She's just
or
making
mouse.
you chase stuff.
Yeah, so she would set up a rhythm. Mm-hmm. She'd hit forehand, backhand, backhand.
Throw you off.
Yeah, and I would get into the rhythm, and then she would throw it off. And, I would always already be anticipating that she was going to go here, and she would go there. It's the same thing with music. You set up something that people are anticipating, and then you don't give it to them. You go in another direction, and that's what really draws in people's interest. If you're hearing the same thing over and over again. I mean, the other night I was at Ralph's shopping, and I had to leave. The music was so bad. It was just so insipid. I mean, this is the same thing over. I could listen to the first bar and sing the rest of the tune.
Right.
Yeah.
You talked about tonality through a whole movie too, and that tennis example works from there too, because she's also kicking your ass with the mental aspect, because she keeps toying with you, and you're like, she is toying with me, know, and she's got you running around like a monkey, back and forth, back and forth. She's wearing you out, while she's just dictating. So you really have no chance in that. Like, she really is in complete control. And if you're arranging properly, you are doing the same thing. Like, you guys don't even understand how hard I'm
toying with you.
Yeah, exactly.
I listened to a Diane Krall recording last night while I was driving, and I don't really listen to her that much. And this is like a new CD for me. And at first I'm listening to it, and I'm thinking, well, there's not a whole lot happening here. And then the more I listened to it, I thought, oh, that's what this is all about. It's, there's no virtuosity, there's no melismatic, bebop, kind of thing. It's just super tasty, and like these little flute lines. It's almost like they're trying to say as little as they possibly can, but really nail whatever it is that they're trying to say. It's like haiku, I guess. Like
haiku, or a beautiful girl with no makeup.
That's good.
Chocolate covered strawberries on like 3 of them on a plate, and you're like, oh, ooh, I will eat every one of those.
I want to give our listeners who may not have the most, at the risk of, there are a lot of percussion instruments around here, and I'm afraid that James is going to hit me over the head with a cowbell for saying this, but listeners, if you want to understand one of the compositional things that's an example of what we're talking about here, I'm going to give you guys the most base example of this, but the John Bon Jovi song "Living on a Prayer."
Okay.
They come back from the guitar solo, and they do the bridge, and then there's just one measure when that's all that you've got, and they just drop out that last note. So they go 4 4 4 4 4 4 3, and then come back.
Right.
And that's one of those places where you're in that groove and you're doing that thing, and then pow, that note just dropping out, that beat dropping out is such a, that just turned around the whole song, but it didn't. They just left off that last note, and it's one of there are probably 1,000 better examples than that one, but I think that's the most easily accessible example of going along, and then bam, it's all different. And it also punctuates the point that you made about the chase, where you have to catch up to stuff. And I feel like that's one of those ways that you played one of your compositions where you were in 6/8, which, like you said, can be divided a lot of ways. And you had something else playing over that was a different signature altogether. But when the climax of the scene came and everything had to drop in right now, it all met. And it was almost Frank Zappa-esque, where
Oh.
two different things would
Take that as a
converge,
compliment.
and you would have no idea
is a-
that was coming, and then they'd be together.
Yeah.
You know, I've always heard throughout my whole life, people postulating that music is based on math. And, I never really bought it that much, but now I get it. And that was one of the big takeaways from Bruce. But talking about your rhythmic thing, yeah, I've actually, since I've been a composer, I've become really good at doing math in my head, adding up, 3 different double-digit numbers quickly, but
Because it happens spatially as opposed to...
yeah. Well, you're as a composer, you're ordering events in time. That's basically your job. And in the example that you gave, where you have 2 different meters going, okay, so you've got one group playing 4/4 across the board, and then you've got another instrument that's dropping a beat every 4 bars. How long will it take for them to catch back up again?
So really, the math problem here is that you're dropping one beat every 4 bars. At what point are you going to reach the common denominator?
Will they come back into
Where is
sync
one
again?
back at one?
Right. Yeah, exactly. But more importantly, what it's really all about are intervallic relationships. If you play a fifth, you play a C and a G above it, that's a very open sound. Every single intervallic relationship, whether it's a minor third or major third, has a personality. And there's a book that I read recently called This Is Your Brain on Music.
Huh.
And I learned so much about music that I never realized. For example, the human brain has areas that are devoted to vision. Okay, well, we know that's this spot right here. But there's not, at least not yet, there's not an exact spot where magenta is, right?
Right. Okay.
Okay. So, but in the human brain, first of all, when you take like that hammered dulcimer there and you pull a bow across it, it creates a vibration and a sound wave. That sound wave doesn't sound like anything until it goes in your ear and your brain turns it into music.
Okay.
Okay. So when you sit down and listen to a piece of music, it's just like the soundboard on that piano. Your whole brain, if I play A440, there's a spot in your brain that is going to
It
vibrate
registers that. Yeah.
at A440. So that's one reason music is such a powerful medium, unlike painting, or visual arts. When you sit down and listen to an orchestra, imagine how your brain is
It
lighting up.
lights up your
Yeah.
whole brain.
Yeah.
In all the different places.
Right.
Because there's a bass drum sound that's repetitive and draws you into something. And then there's something else that's textural and in the soprano register.
That's
and you're,
fantastic.
So
that's
thinking
amazing.
thinking mathematically, the whole idea of Western music is based on the overtone series, which is what those little twirly things do. They play the overtone series. And every single interval, like an octave is completely neutral. A fifth is kind of open. A fourth is kind of has a quality of being unresolved, just suspended. A major third typically is happy. A minor third is sad. A second is, again, suspended but with more tension. A minor second is dissonant. A tritone, a lowered fifth, is like the devil's interval. A major seventh can go either way. So when you start stacking up all these intervals, and now we're not talking about triads. We're talking about really complex chords, and they're made up of fifths and thirds. You're basically describing a very complex human emotion.
right.
Like,
Yeah.
if you have a relationship with somebody,
A stack of emotions.
exactly. I mean, if you're in love with someone, it's not just that you're in love with them, and
Right.
it's a whole amalgam.
Sometimes they really piss you off.
Yeah, exactly. I
Other
mean,
times they really make you joyful.
that's the power of music, is to be able to describe that in mathematical terms. But I'm not thinking about math. I'm just thinking, it's a it's just sort of a gift. Like,
Yeah.
you know how to gravitate to those intervals to make it happen.
And anymore you understand that stack of emotions and you want to put it upon somebody. And now you're able to play a chord and feel that stack and hand it to somebody. Because it's not anything until it's perceived.
Well, that's
Right.
the thing I was going to say. You had said earlier about how this is how you hear the music when you play the piano or whatever it is. But really, what you're playing you're playing emotions,
Right.
and that, you already know like this is how this should be perceived in this people.
No, but you might even be playing against the emotions.
Sure, yeah,
You know.
yeah,
Creating further tension.
dissonance and
Exactly.
tension.
Yeah.
That-
there was a commercial I did a while ago for Axe body spray. Basically, they're selling sex.
It's my favorite.
Pheromones, yeah. And so, I'm in competition with like 25 other composers, and I have time, so I write 2 demos, right? And this spot was called Anarchy. So like all these people are just like in heat. and this whole city just like melts down, car crashes and bus crashes and all this stuff. It's
The
hilarious.
city's called Pete'sville.
Yeah,
So the first one I did was a tango. I mean, come on, a tango is always funny.
It's
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 lusty,
lustful,
right?
yeah, a little manic and lustful.
But then I had a chance to do another one, and I started thinking about the end of Dr. Strangelove.
wow.
When Slim Pickens is riding the
riding on
bomb
the bomb,
down,
yeah.
and then it goes into a montage of atomic bomb explosions with this sort of Nelson Riddle gorgeous arrangement of "We'll Be Together Again." I thought, oh, that's cool. It's like totally. So I wrote this big lush string arrangement, and it worked like gangbusters, So sometimes you're going,
Counter
in
to
the other direction.
Counter to the obvious.
Here's an interesting point. Guess what interval your typical car horn is?
That sounds unresolved to me. So, what was the unresolved one? The minor third?
Or yeah,
No,
or the
tritone
second.
is the devil's interval.
Devil's interval.
It's actually a major third.
Okay.
But you would think, like giving people a warning,
Yeah.
that it would be like a tritone. It's not.
When I think about other composers in your peer group, I think about French horns and John Williams going together because that guy loves French horns. And I think about horns with Danny Elfman, but a darker form of horns. When people describe you, what comes to mind? Is it an instrument? Is it a feeling? How do you think they describe it?
I really wouldn't know. I mean, I'd like to know the answer to that myself. I mean, I tend to use, I don't know. I mean, there's some things I gravitate towards because I have a certain fluency with fretted instruments. You know, I mean, I tend to use guitars, but I really don't like using electric guitar that much. I mean, I don't really like using drums that much. I'd rather use percussion.
That's funny because the way that you play fretted instruments is percussive.
Yeah, he's a percussionist. Yeah.
I mean,
thank you.
that's what I gathered. I mean, you have 1,000 percussion instruments in this room, but the things that you did and even the textures that you created with stringed instruments, you play a lot of stuff that's finger picked, and you play a lot of stuff that seems like you're creating those feelings with rhythms, along with the chords, of course.
Well, I'll tell you something that I discovered a long time ago is that you have to think about where music came from.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what were the first instruments? Your voice,
Sticks that you could bang together,
your voice,
and your ability
and
to yell.
percussion. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, that's kind of elemental to people's DNA. And so I find that people really gravitate towards rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
And rhythm is a great way to lock people in and then lose them, I mean, or do whatever you want to do.
Right.
I mean, you can draw them in and keep them there, or you can draw them in and then
And
leave
make
them
them
at the
feel
altar.
deserted. Leave them at the altar, yeah.
Taking it back that far to the roots of music and everything. Recent episode of Live from Daryl's House had Wycliffe on there, and he was talking about how music is all around you. It's the birds and the trees, and that means there's a dude who sees that and says, I need this rock and this stick, and I'm going to rub them together, and it's going to kind of create that feeling that so this started from day one, and
And it's all around this room. When we walked
Right.
in, for our listeners, James took us on a tour of the room, which is not an enormous room, but it's a good-sized room. And there are instruments all over the place here.
And you have
there
to
are
touch 'em.
Instruments that aren't instruments.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a candy dish over there. There's a candlestick holder. There's a bunt cake
Yeah,
pan.
don't forget the bunt pan.
Yeah. James says that the meat grinder's decoration, but
There's some tiki.
it's going to
tiki
get banged on
torches
at
over
some
there,
point.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I drive some of my friends crazy because, we'll go.
Start playing their stuff at their house.
Yeah, I mean, we'll go out in public, and walking through a store, and I'll just stop. There's a little flower pot over there made out of hammered brass that I bought at Target for $15. It's an amazing Udu.
Right.
See, he's just a boy. He like, I gotta taste everything and touch everything and smack it with a stick. Like you never grew up. That's what it is. You got that curiousness.
Yeah.
So you have a piece of music in mind and you play it, and it creates an emotion. Let's say sad emotion. Can you, when you see the visual and you hear your music, can you make yourself cry?
No.
No, it's hard.
Well, I take that back. There was one time. You remember that Aftermath cue that I played for you?
Yes.
It was mostly strings. My reputation was kind of on the line with that because that was for a show that was a really big deal, and I was working with Bruce, and it was a very important moment in the film. And I was bound and determined to write something that was just going to hit it out of the park. And I haven't had this experience maybe 2-3 times in 30 years. I was working really late, and all of a sudden, this is going to sound really ethereal, whatever you want to call it, but I honestly felt this spirit come into the room, and it wasn't coming from me. It was coming through me.
Yes.
And it was so intense, I couldn't get it down on the paper fast enough. And I wound up getting a thrombosis in my leg, a big, huge bruise. It was kind of scary, you know? I mean,
Wow.
so I didn't start crying, but it was very powerful emotion.
Yeah.
But I have had people sit in this chair and start crying just when I'm playing stuff like him.
I absolutely can imagine that because you
Yeah.
took us on an emotional merry-go-round. I think it's hard to ask the question, or hard to answer that question like, yeah, I can make myself cry, because we can't make ourselves blink or whatever other involuntary thing that you know you're going to do something, so you don't do it because you're the one creating the emotion or the tension or whatever. But I think that when you have the ability to take a person on the ride, sometimes people go on a ride that you didn't expect, or you've taken them so deep on the ride that you go, wow, that really worked even better than I thought it would.
Yeah.
And that's where our artistry and the training and all of the things that you've been through that bring you to the point where you're creating come together. And I think that your ability to deliver that for us is the gift that we appreciate. My only question before we close up is that, I know you have a number of projects coming up. You always do. But what I'd really like to do, and, we're going to stay in touch with you, but when you've had that moment that you feel like you've taken somebody on the ride and it's substantial, I'm really going to beg that you call us and you say, you know what, let's put a mic in front of us again. Because I had that moment, and I want to capture your feelings about that moment.
Great.
Would you do that for us?
Sure, absolutely.
Plus, just in general, you've got a lot more story to tell. I don't know
Yeah.
if you can tell, but
We scratched the surface.
I'll tell you something. When I don't mean to make this political, but when Donald Trump got elected, I had to go see a therapist. I just couldn't grasp it.
Yeah.
And I sat down and I spilled the beans, and her response was, "You don't need therapy. You need to write a book."
yeah.
Hey, you got a lot in there you got to spill
You had
out.
a lot of stuff. I do want to say this too before we get too much further. Thank you to Hilliard, because you were on Hilliard's show.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're here on the lot where we often record our show, and we love Hilliard. We love Hilliard's show, the Screenwriters Rant Room. And so just thank you for that. And I'm glad that we got a chance to hook up with you, because it's just a fantastic show.
Because of circumstance and just timing, we've been trying to do this with you for several weeks now, and it was worth it, all of the anticipation.
That's very nice of you to say. I really appreciate that. And I feel the same way. It was fun talking to you guys.
All right. So for our listeners, keep your ears open. Ladies and gentlemen, James Stemple.
Hey, where do we find you on the webs? I know you have some presences. If people want to-
JamesStemple.com.
There you go.
It's the best
And
place.
when you go there, there's a sizzle reel, so you can see music against picture. There's a bio, and then there's a bunch of sort of boutique projects. Not the mainstream stuff, but things that I thought were really unique and outstanding. So you can just click around.
Perfect.
And everybody check it all out, because each one of those little pieces is a neat little ride that everybody goes on their individual ride. I mean, when Pete and I listened to things, we'd go, oh, you know what I did? And then we'd compare the pictures in our heads, and they were always different.
Always.
They had their similarities and stuff, but everybody goes on their individual ride. And that sizzle reel is about 9 minutes long, and it's a fun Fun 9 minutes.
Here's the other thing too that you get when you listen to this kind of a show and you go to James's site is when you watch a movie or a commercial now, there's that much more enjoyment because you're like, oh my goodness.
I know that we're going to have listeners who will now notice that there is music. There isn't just a feel. You know, when I watched that commercial and I laughed and then I got, and they didn't realize it was the music that did it. And so for some of our listeners, I hope that you'll now enjoy noticing that there's music.
I sure as hell enjoy you. Thank you so much for coming on the
It's
show.
really nice. Thank you. Glad to be here.